so many tanks are changing next update, let's talk about the best tech tree tanks to grind right now. Just a little disclaimer here. Those tanks are receiving the most interesting changes and the biggest buffs, so they might not be the best overall after all, but still I think those are the ones that you want to grind there. Keep in mind that the game footage that I'm showing was recorded on the last update or on the current update, and it is not showing the updated tanks yet. So let's start with my top 10 and break it down with a couple of tanks for each tank class. Starting with the heavy tanks, the IS-4 is getting some nice changes again. It has been strong in the past, it will be strong in the future again. At the moment it's rather meh, not that great actually, but this tank is a very easy tank to play. It does have a strong turret, it gets to have some nice hull armor as well again, which is currently not the best anymore, but it gets a little bit of a buff there. Also it gets a DPM buff, also it gets a mobility buff. Just keep in mind that this tank also has a special speed boost, so it allows you to put a tank with a lot of hit points and a lot of armor into some very strong positions very quickly, and you're also able to run from those again. With this kind of DPM and armor and mobility you can push out enemies very nicely. Only downside to this one is that it doesn't have the best accuracy, but I think I can live with it. So just use this tank in multiple different ways. There is really almost nothing wrong that you can do with it except for camping. You can counter mediums, you can counter heavy tanks. It's an awesome all-rounder tank. Next up is the VZ55, kind of an underrated tank, although I lately played it on stream and it was working out quite nicely. But this one does get an autoloader gun instead of the single shot gun that it currently has. And that autoloader is actually going to have some really nice DPM on top of that, and it is really having some great accuracy. This tank is going to be benefiting as well from the other autoloaders just losing out in statistics, so this one will be even stronger in comparison. The armor is decent, you can play hull down, you can not really side scrape all too well, but you can just use that armor in many ways, and you are just having that big alpha gun of 460 damage times 2, which allows you to out-trade any enemy to the front. Also the mobility is fairly decent, so I think this one is also an easy autoloader that allows for a lot of damage output quite quickly. On the downside, the intra-clip reload time is at 4 seconds then, which isn't all that great to be honest. Still, I think if you put out 460 damage times 2 into any enemy, they are likely going to cry afterwards. And the next one will be surprising. The E100 stock gun is getting some very nice buffs. While previously the E100 was mostly played for that big alpha damage gun, and that was the most fun part of it, you already knew if anyone was playing that stock gun, that small gun, they were most likely not going to be the greatest player after all. But now the stock gun is actually getting some really nice changes to the aim time and also to the DPM. It will have a fairly big DPM for a high alpha damage gun. It's still having 460 damage, that's pretty big actually. Nice accuracy, nice DPM, also E100 getting mobility buff. I will definitely switch from a big gun to a small one, and then you're having a super heavy, kind of like a mouse, slightly worse armor, but much better damage output. I think the E100 is definitely a very interesting one next update. Just a quick honorable mention here, also the Type 71 is getting some nice change by having that premium ammunition getting a buff, so it almost has the same amount of damage per shot as the standard ammunition. Moving on to the TDs. The Heavies already got some buffs in the recent past, and it will get some other buffs on top of that. Mainly we are only talking about the DPM and the shell velocity, but we have to keep in mind that the biggest competitors of the Heavies, like the VZ113 GFT, are getting nerfed, so actually the Heavies will be a lot better. This tank has an awesome gun, it does like the most amazing gun ever. You are having very nice accuracy, you are having a huge amount of penetration, and the premium AP ammunition has almost the same damage per shot as your standard rounds as well. So basically you can play this premium ammo only, kind of pay to win, but who cares. On top of that, it also has a reactive armor which diminishes or decreases the damage taken by 27%. So this tank is just mainly a nice farming tank, but can play semi-aggressively in second row and has some pushing abilities definitely as well. onto the Foch 155, which currently does have some nice mobility and an autoloader just as a single shotgun. Both of them are interesting. It is already a good one. The power to weight ratio gets nerfed a little bit, or quite a lot actually, but this tank does get a big alpha damage buff to that standard round on actually both shells, on both guns, but mainly on that autoloader gun where you currently have 500 damage per shot that gets increased to 560 while not even losing out on much of a DPM. So actually that's a DPM buff there. Keep in mind this tank has speed boost, a special speed boost, and tungsten rounds. The tungsten rounds give you 15% damage on top, so you end up at 644 damage times 2 with your autoloader gun. That is absolutely big. And the changes don't end there yet. It also gets some armor buff to the frontal plate. So this one will be quite hilarious for pushing into the enemies. Although of course you lack a little bit in mobility, still I think the changes here are very nice. So we've had our heavies and TDs. Next up are the medium tanks. I've got 2 medium tanks for you here which are going to dominate the game like crazy. One of those is the E50M, which is already very strong. It is an amazing all-rounder tank having good armor, great ramming abilities, and also it does have some decent DPM. But on that it gets a big increase there. It gets a big DPM buff, so a reload time buff, and also it gets reactive armor on top of that, again decreasing the damage taken by 27%, and it also gets some slight armor buffs on top of that. So with this tank you can kind of sidestep, you can go hull down, you can push out enemies, and that's the main strength of the E50M. At a medium distance it's just not all that great actually, but still very capable. But if you manage to push into some enemies, they can almost not penetrate you in face hug. You are really well armored, unless the enemies are much higher than you and are having a lot of penetration. But you're having this great armor, a good amount of hit points due to reactive armor, and you're having great DPM as well, so you can absolutely bully those enemies right to your face. Contrary to the E50M, the CS63 is going to have a very different playstyle. This one is rather for the more experienced players. It is one that doesn't have a ton of armor. Still, it's very nice. It does have some nice gun with AP and APCR and good accuracy that actually gets a buff there as well. Also, it will be even faster and it will get much better DPM, so it will be one of the best DPM tanks in the game. It will have characteristics similar to those of the Leo 1 actually, just slightly better armor, so easier to play for everyone. And this one also does have the tungsten rounds and adrenaline. I can always recommend only using both of them at the same time for maximizing that DPM definitely. Also, it still has the reticle calibration, but I definitely prefer tungsten rounds here to just put out that damage in short amount of time and out-trade the enemies really nicely. If you're having that kind of mobility for quick relocations and also that kind of DPM, you can get into some very nasty positions for punishing the enemies that are being only slightly too aggressive, or you flank around and all that kind of stuff. And as if this wasn't enough yet, it will also get the adaptive concealment. This is the thing that gets you unspotted after only 7 seconds instead of 10, which we already know from the VZ light tank. Talking about the VZ Light tank, this is the next one on the list. And the VZ Light actually also gets some big DPM buff. It gets a mobility buff due to receiving gear oil. Keep in mind, this is the thing that gets you to be 6% or just having 6% more on the engine power, 6% more on the traverse speed, 4 km per hour on top to the forwards and reverse speed as well. So this is going to be the fastest light tank in the game with great DPM as well. Something to keep in mind with the VZ Light is that it doesn't have any armor and it doesn't have much gun depression, but it has some pretty nice alpha damage of 360. And you're also just not having the best accuracy, so you will have to aim in a little bit more. But this is one of the best tanks for flanking around next update. For some passive gameplay, just running around the map and really being nasty, being that bee stinging the enemies into that rear. Also the VZ Lite, of course, does have the adaptive concealment, getting you unspotted after only 7 seconds, so you are just a little bit safer. And you also see the enemy spotting you, just to mention that one still. That's a very important skill that you have there. You do see that little eye on top of the enemies. If they do see you, you know immediately, as long as they are spotted, so you can back off into cover as soon as you know that they are paying attention to you. But that's not it about the light tanks here, because almost all the light tanks are getting buffs, apart from the Batshit, which is getting nerfed. The other light tanks getting some very interesting changes here are, first of all, the 2100 LT. And this one just gets some nice DPM buff as well. Currently it's lacking a bit in the DPM side, but soon it will have some better DPM again. And it is already quite strong. It will be very nice for farming and also flanking, similar to the VZ light tank's characteristics. Not a tank you want to face the enemies frontally with, but a tank you want to flank around with. That's also when you can make use of the tracer shells. This is the special mechanic that this tank has, which allows you to keep the enemy spotted for an entire 20 seconds instead of the usual 10. This means you can shoot the enemies, keep them spotted for 20 seconds, and you can even back off into cover or somewhere where they cannot spot you anymore, and you can repetitively shoot the enemies, keeping them spotted, really messing up their game, especially if they are some camping TDs or so. They will be absolutely useless for a long time, and you can farm them very, very nicely. So for that reason alone, I already think that the T100 is not only going to be dominant in random games, but also in tournaments. It will most likely be the main light tank there again. Another thing I really like about the T100 LT is that it still has decent armor. It's not well armored at all, but it has a very low, small silhouette that is very hard to penetrate or very hard to hit in the first place, and also having some tiny turret with a decent armor, so you can just peek and get some nice ricochets. You can also just shoot the enemies very easily due to some nice accuracy and also having premium AP rounds, which make it a lot easier to penetrate the enemies. For the last tank, I want to mention the Vickers light tank. One tank that is currently suffering a lot in this matter. It's not good at all, but next update it will have some very big changes to it. This one will receive hash as the premium ammunition instead of heat, so this makes it be a tank that is rather for the experienced players. I mean, you need to be good at choosing the ammunition wisely. Otherwise the hash is going to be quite useless. Also the alpha damage is fairly low, so nothing that is all too easy to play with. Also you don't have any armor on top of that. But just for the better players, or if you just enjoy some fast tanks for fun, the Vickers light tank is going to be amazing. It gets some DPM buff as well. And this one already has the reticle calibration, getting you to have some very nice accuracy, allowing you to flank very effectively and put out a huge amount of DPM with that hash into the enemy's sides and rear. I think I'm going to spam this tank a lot. It's going to be so much fun to hash the enemies into demise. But again, this is a light tank, so nothing you want to face enemies frontally with. It's a tank that is great for flanking around, great for spotting at the start, but you don't want to look at any enemy pre-aiming you already, otherwise you're just going to get penetrated into that turret quite easily. I hope you enjoyed this short list. Let me know what you are most excited for down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, this is Nino, goodbye.